Well, okay. Let's move back in time to the Greek world. For those of you who weren't here, we've covered Aristotle and then a little bit on the Hellenistic philosophers, which would be the Cynics, the skeptics, the Epicureans, and the Stoics. Not a lot to say about them because they, I describe them as more life coaches than serious philosophers, and that's kind of how it is. Yeah, Jeff.
I don't recall you saying anything about the skeptics.
Yeah, actually, I didn't. I lied. I didn't say much about the skeptics, but the skeptics. All these guys are talking about stuff that was well covered by Plato. It's kind of interesting that um, but Plato addresses them as serious problems rather than, Epicurus and Marcus Aurelius, they're going to kind of just say nice things about how you should live. Whereas Socrates would have said, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? So there's a different kind of intellectual um, discipline and approach to Plato or that Plato takes as opposed to these guys. Now, this is a very condensed course. So you could spend a whole semester on just that group of philosophers if you wanted to. So, and that goes doubly for what we're going to get into now, or actually not doubly, more like 100 times, because the tradition of Christianity, you know, philosophy, let's face it, is kind of a niche interest. Not that many people are interested. There are a billion, at least a billion Christians on the earth, and I am sure there are not a billion philosophy students. And they are emotionally attached to this tradition. And indeed, uh, I think I said this before. If you want to learn about Western intellectual development, you can get a Plato book for about $10 and steal a Gideon Bible, and you'll know 90% of, or at least you'll have become aware of 90% of Western thinking. That's an exaggeration, but not that much, because the next 1,000 years that we're going to talk about now is dominated by Christianity, and to many ways, thinking is still dominated by Christianity. And there are things, people, I have friends that just, Christians, screw them, I hate Christians, blah, blah, blah. This is a massive thing to throw away. You're throwing out so much of Western culture that it's a little bit, uh, I don't know, if you want to understand Western intellectual traditions, you can't do it without studying Christianity. It's just too important and influenced everything else afterward. So, uh, what I'm going to do is you can approach, well, first of all, we're just going to talk about Christianity. I know there are those of you who are interested in other religions. I've studied other religions, although I confess I've never read the Zen Avesta, which is Zoroastrianism. I'm not familiar with that, but I have read the Upanishads and the Vedas and the Sutras and the Quran and the Bible twice from beginning to end, and I don't recommend that. But it's better than the Quran in terms of being readable. Um, so maybe we'll start out with that. There's a lot of ways to look at Christianity. You can look at it from a Marxist point of view, from a Jungian point of view, from a historical point of view. Uh, you can look at it from a scriptural point of view. There's just a lot of lenses through which you can judge or understand what Christianity is. Anyway, it was a little cult that started in well, zero, we think, or a little after zero, in mainly in Jerusalem, and there was a controversy about whether uh, it should spread beyond there, and the controversy is about Paul. Paul wanted to spread the word to the Gentiles, which he did. And Meredith said last time, I think, that if there were no Paul, there'd be no Christianity. I don't know. You can't prove a negative like that. Maybe that's the case. Peter, I think, did you say that you'd read How the Bible Came to Be?
Is that a title?
Wait.
Yeah, there's a book called How the Bible Came to Be. I
No,
thought
I
I
haven't
thought
read
one
that.
of you had read that. Oh, you guys. Okay. I would recommend that if that's a kind of interesting thing to you. It's a short book. It's not uh, intellectually well, it's intellectually uh, reliable, but it isn't overly in the weeds or tedious. And it's really quite an amazing book because it kind of simplifies. This didn't just happen. God didn't just uh, beam the Bible down to earth. A bunch of people were involved in historical uh, movements were involved in composing the Bible as we know it now, and that occurred the first two or three, 4 centuries of the after the birth of Christ. The first um, actual gospel we have is the Gospel of Mark, who that was written about 70 AD, and so that's about 40 years after the death of Christ. So between 30 and 70 AD, we've got a verbal tradition, no doubt, and some people think that the uh, sayings of Jesus in the Bible were originally in Aramaic, which is very possible. That was Jesus's language, but the entire Bible, New Testament, is written in Greek. And so the people that wrote it were, I mean, they were literate, so they had an education, or else they couldn't have written. And there's somewhat of a possibility that they were familiar with some of the Greek thinkers. At least they were influenced by them, whether or not they'd actually read Plato and Aristotle and those guys. They were probably influenced by the culture that they existed in. So anyway, as the Christian tradition became less of a cult and more of a I think it was in the fourth century AD that it became legal to be a Christian in Rome. And then after that, it became the state religion in Rome. And about 100 years later, the Roman Empire fell. You can make of that what you will. I don't think it had anything to do with the adoption of Christianity. But that's before that, as the Christians like to point out ad nauseum, Christians were persecuted. And I mentioned last time that they were persecuted as a national security threat because they weren't as I said, the Romans were worried that if they didn't worship the right gods and sacrifice the right gods, that they wouldn't be favored in battle. That was their concern. It wasn't theological so much as it was, and that's the way they thought. Now, there were a lot of healers around like Jesus. He wasn't the only guy that would raise people from the dead and cure cancer and whatever he did. And the Gospel of Mark is the first one, and that is full of that kind of stuff, more than Matthew, Luke, and John. The Gospel of Mark has a lot of healings that Jesus does. So he was like a healer. Um, there's a pursuit called the quest for the historical Jesus, otherwise known as Christology. And so that's the effort to actually fill out the picture of who Jesus was, because basically we have the Bible, we have the Gospels, and that's it. Uh, People try to say that there's references to Jesus elsewhere, but those are dodgy, and um, sometimes they're hatchet jobs, and sometimes they're the opposite. They're trying to bolster his reputation. But mainly, we have the Gospels, is what we have to know who Jesus was. I had a class, I had a class in Christology at the Yale Divinity School. That guy was astonishing. You know, before Google, you couldn't find a quote. He just knew the whole Bible. He had memorized the whole Bible. And how they do Christology is they look at every reference to Jesus, say Jesus as Lord or Master or whatever title, the Messiah, whatever title is given to him, the guys who study Christology, what they do is look for any use of that term, any place in the contemporary world, any other literature that uses that word. And then from that, they try to figure out how the people that were referencing Jesus um, were really what they really meant by the title they were addressing him with, right? So, but we know
Just looking at your bed, okay?
what, oh, we know squat about him beyond the Bible, really. Jefferson, a couple of the founding fathers had interest. They were deists, and that means they believed in God, but they didn't necessarily believe in the God that was described in the Bible. And one of the great ones was Thomas Paine, who wrote a book called The Age of Reason, which I really recommend if you this is such a it's a great critique of the Bible. It's merciless, and Paine is really one of the interesting founding fathers. Uh, but he points out, for example, that in the Bible he points out a bunch of stuff that's just what the hell, like some really horrible things that were done by Moses, for example. And one of the funny things to me was he points out the fact that there are two genealogies of Jesus given in the Gospels, and they're not consistent with one another. So you think, well, God may have created the universe, but he wasn't that much of a editor. Uh, how could that be? And of course, Christian apologists. I remember I've clarified the word apologist as regards theologians to mean that they try to explain things like this. And one of the explanations is that it was really one of them is Mary's genealogy, and the other is Joseph's genealogy. But the problem with that is that Joseph wasn't really the father of Jesus, was he? Because Mary was a virgin. And it's really a tortured logic to try to figure out and make sense of all of the things in the Bible. And my favorite story about this is one that Kierkegaard says. He says this young priest goes to the older priest and he says, I've been studying the Bible and I've been noticing all these inconsistencies and anachronisms and terrible things that just don't make any sense, and I don't know what to do about it. And the older priest says, "Tell you what, go out and do everything you understand, and when you've mastered that, come back to me and we'll talk about the rest." In other words, obey the golden rule. Love your brother as yourself. All those things. They're easy to understand. Go do that. And of course, that's such a funny story because it's an infinite challenge, isn't it? I mean, not none of us can do that with perfection, and so the old priest is telling him, "Okay, do this impossible thing, and then come back to me, and we'll talk about the discrepancies." Anyway, so the Bible, I don't think you can make sense. I don't. And what Jefferson did was, I don't know if you know this. There's something called the Jefferson Bible, which I don't have. I wish I did, but what Jefferson did, what you can buy it. He took out everything except what Jesus said, all the stuff about Jesus, because he didn't want to believe in all the nonsense and all the supernatural weird stuff and that kind of stuff. So Jefferson was a rationalist, and this is kind of similar to what Paine did. So people that try to portray the founding fathers as dyed in the wool by the book Christians are not familiar with the founding fathers. That's not what it's not that they were anti-Christian. They certainly would they probably wouldn't have survived if they were, but they took it with a grain of salt and added a bit of humanism to it. It was the age of enlightenment. These guys were products of the enlightenment of the founding fathers. Okay, with all that said, I'm not going to look at the Bible from a Marxist or Jungian point of view. All that stuff is legit. I don't know, legit is the right word, but worth doing. All those other interpretations of how what the Bible means and all that. Uh, Marx famously said it's the opiate of the proletariat. In other words, this is how you put them to sleep, is say, well, life will be good when you're dead, so forget about how terrible it is right now. This is, I think, what Marx's intention was. I'm not going to deal with all that stuff. I'm not saying it's not worthy of looking into. I'm just not going to deal with that. The way I'm going to deal with it is what I want to do is do a compare and contrast between the way the Greeks approached uh, big questions of life and the way the Christians did. And in doing so, one of the necessities is that I have to make generalizations about Christian theology. But I think those generalizations are well founded. In other words, I'm not going to say anything radical about what Christians believe. I think I can defend what I'm saying as being pretty core beliefs of Christianity and how those differ from the approaches made by um, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. So I'm just going to divide this by the five divisions that we usually associate with philosophy, which is ontology, which you'll remember is what is real. The second is epistemology, what our evidence for what is real is. The third one is ethics, how we should behave. The fourth one is aesthetics, what beauty is. And the fifth one is psychology, what the human mind is like. So I'm going to go through those and try to compare and contrast the worlds of Plato and Socrates with uh, the core doctrines of Christianity. So that's how I'm going to do it. And uh, I'll leave aside all the kind of other interpretations, like for what I mentioned, Marx and Jung and so forth. So, with that, let me just get going on the difference between the ontology of um, Christianity and the ontology of the Greeks. By the way, I think I mentioned that we I categorize the Euthyphro as the first uh, Western examination of theology. In other words, it's the first theological work. That's not what it's called but what in that dialogue, what Socrates does is he examines Euthyphro's beliefs and he says, well, Socrates is not trying to say I'm an atheist. He's saying, well, you want me to believe this, but this is contradicted by this other thing you said. So he puts uh, Euthyphro on the spot to try to figure this out. Why does this not make sense? Um, Now, this is prior, obviously, to Christianity, and it's in a world that is polytheistic. So I'm not going to say that this is specifically a Christian theological work, but it does set the standard for how theology has to be done in the future. Okay, so let's just start with the Greeks, um, and we'll just kind of list their core beliefs and compare them to Christians. So with the Greeks, there is no personal God that's attached to you and pays attention to everything you do. That there isn't one. There are various gods that you can maybe appeal to, and maybe they'll pay attention to you, and maybe they won't. But they're certainly aren't conscious of you every second of the day. For example, Jesus says that if you lust, Jimmy Carter was famous for saying, if you lust in your heart after a woman, then you're sinning. Well, that's a pretty strict rule. And how is God going to know? I don't think Zeus would know if you lusted in your heart. And Aphrodite would say right on, but they're not paying attention to your consciousness every day or every second. As Christopher Hitchens described it, it's the North Korea of the soul to say that you're under examination every second. Even your thoughts about lusting after a woman are sins. So that's certainly not the case in the Greeks. Okay, another one is that in Christianity we have something called original sin. This is described by Paul in his letter to the Romans. And the term original sin does not occur in the Bible, but it does with later theologians, and it's a big a deal. And the original sin is that Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore they got thrown out of the Garden of Eden. And every human being since then, by birth, inherits that original sin, that distance from God. That's the way everyone is born. And the bookend to that is the only way out of that is by the sacrifice of Jesus. And through Jesus, all our sins are redeemed. However, there's a very touchy and central point in the history of Christianity, which is it goes under the name of justification by works or faith. And Augustine and St. Paul say that you're justified by faith alone. In other words, you can't save yourself by just being a good person. This is also what Martin Luther said, not Martin Luther King, but the original Martin Luther, said that you can't be justified by works. And this has been a controversy ever since Augustine, because it kind of said the thing is the idea is that um, that being uh, uh, forgiven and given the grace of God is entirely an act that uh, is in God's hands. He's the one that, by His grace, redeems you. You can't redeem yourself because you're just a finite human being that's weak and full of sin and indecision, but God can give you that. That's the idea, and that's why they say you can't be justified by works. And so, no matter how good you are, if you're infinitely good and you never have a lust for a woman in your heart ever your whole life, which is a little hard to imagine, then you still can't be justified or redeemed by the Christian faith. Which, if I was going to be cynical, I would say what this means is that the church is your only ticket to salvation, period. So you must join the church or you're damned to hell. Now, the Catholics got in trouble with this with the, geez, what do you call it? You know, when you had to pay to get into heaven. I'm going to think of the word in a minute.
Indulgences.
Indulgences, exactly. So they got in trouble with this because, wait a minute, if I can only be justified by faith, how can I pay somebody and by that do a good work that, that, okay. So anyway, this is a long, thousands of pages of theology are involved here, and I'm not going to get into that far, but just all I want to say is we have original sin. There's no such thing in the Greeks at all, nothing remotely related to that. The closest you can say is that the Greeks, Aristotle and Plato, think that unless you engage in the examination of your life, you're probably going to live less of a life than somebody who does. That's the famous quote by Socrates. So that's as close as you're going to get to anything like original sin. And really, there is nothing close to it at all. Okay. Um, the Whether the soul is eternal or not. This is all under the heading of ontology, by the way. Whether the soul, in other words, what is real? Whether the soul is eternal or not is disagreed with by Plato and Aristotle. Disagree on this. Plato and Socrates seem to remember everything's always couched in this being, well, that's what the myth says, they don't commit to it, but they seem to think that that's the only explanation for the fact that we have the kind of knowledge that is displayed in the Meno, that we must have had a prior life. That's basically it. And but they don't spend a lot of time talking about heaven. Whereas with Christianity, the doctrine is your soul is eternal, and it's either going to go to hell or going to go to heaven or spend eternity in purgatory. There's no just ending of life, which is kind of daunting, but that's the tick. I mean, that is the story. I've mentioned before that the Greeks had a vague idea of, the Elysian fields and Tartarus and Hades and so forth, but it wasn't the center at all of their thinking about the good life or the moral life. It was more like uh, you wanted to understand what the essence of life is so that you could live a good life while you were alive, not so much thinking about when you're dead. All right. So, any questions so far about on the ontology of the Christians? All right, I'm going to move on. Oh yeah, Meredith.
Yes.
I just want to ask one question I've had about the story of Jesus for my whole life. And that is on the cross, Jesus is said to have cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I've always wondered, did Jesus not know that the sacrifice of himself was going to become the foundation of a religion? Or, I mean, was he not himself as a man knowledgeable about the part that he was supposed to play in this uh the crucifixion thing?
All right. Well, this is a theological problem that is gnarly as the Trinity. It is the Trinity problem. The heresy is called Pelagianism, which is that God and Jesus were different, but the Trinity holds that God and Jesus were part of the Trinity. In other words, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So how do you explain what exactly you said? How do you explain Jesus didn't seem to know about this? And there are a variety of, there's 100,000 pages of discussion of this in Christian theology, and I'm not going to resolve it here, Meredith. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to say I can't resolve it for you, but it's one of those gnarly problems of Christian theology that, like I say, the apologists try to understand and account for.
Well,
Uh, one accounting for it, by the way, is that in order for God, okay, I'm not saying this is gospel
Rick,
or
Jesus was a Jew to begin
that's
with. He wasn't. He didn't know anything about
well,
Christianity.
that's true. That's
You know.
true.
No,
That
of
this is
course not. But why did he what
Well, he had no idea. I mean, come on.
well, the idea is that one idea anyway is for God to become incarnate and understand what it was like, because the idea is God becomes incarnate so he can experience the human life that everybody else does. And so, in that guise of being human, he doesn't have uh, access to the knowledge that God has, because if he did, he'd be fully God the whole time, which he isn't. So this is, like I say, the controversy is you can look up you look up the Pelagian, Pelagianism. Pelagianism is the controversy. But yeah, it's a big one. Yeah, Peter.
Isn't it Arianism that Christ was
Well,
not
it's both
really?
of them. Yeah, Arianism is another one. Yeah, that
Well, Arians didn't believe in original sin. They believed that, we were completely free to choose good or evil. And one result of that is that they were much harder on sinners than Orthodox Christians like Augustine were.
that's right. And this is a Arianism is actually a closer heresy than Pelagianism. Pelagianism is about free will, but then the question is, did Jesus have free will or not? And uh, it's like I say, 100,000 pages of theology here, and I'm not going to resolve it. But Meredith has put her finger on well, the Trinity is also a problem. Well, it is the problem of the Trinity. And there are sects that don't believe that God and Jesus were the same. And there are sects that believe that, um, I think the Nicene Creed is going to tell you that they are the same. But it's a long history of 2,000 years that I'm not going to be able to resolve the conflicts in today. So if you're a Christian, you just say you just have to have faith, which I always thought was a lame answer. In other words, you're giving up the argument and you're not going to explain it. You're just going to say, "Hey, dude, uh, there's something accusatory about that. You have to have, in other words, you clearly don't have faith, or you wouldn't ask me that question." We're going to get back to that argument in a minute. But thanks, Peter, for that. Yeah, Arianism is probably a better name for that. Um,
How do you
okay,
spell that? Spell it.
Arianism is Arianism, Arianism. And then Pelagius was another guy. So yeah, these are eternal conflicts within the Christian theology. They're not easily answered. And we'll get to the problem of evil, which is just as gnarly. Okay, let's move on to epistemology. Epistemology is uh, what evidence you use for your beliefs, right? So um, in uh, philosophy, and these are not terms used by Plato and Aristotle, but in philosophy, um, we only allow a priori and a posteriori evidence. In other words, the evidence of your senses, which is a posteriori, or a priori, which is logic. And this develops in the history of philosophy. Another similar pair of terms is uh, synthetic versus analytic, logical versus empirical. All those pairs are similar in their meaning, but not exactly the same. And but that's all we allow. We're not going to allow any supernatural authority to um, inform us. And there's no scripture in any kind of philosophy. There's no scripture except for the Christian um, theologians. By the way, I should say that people often oppose Christian or theology or religious belief to philosophy. That's uh, not a fair distinction because Aquinas was a philosopher. Augustine is usually studied in philosophy. Some philosophers were religious, like Descartes. Um, some philosophers were atheists, like Hume and Nietzsche. So it's more like a weaving than it is one group versus another group. Just to clarify that, it's a much less clear picture than that one opposing another. And most theologians, beginning with Aristotle at least, if not earlier, understand Plato and Aristotle, or have done some study of Plato and Aristotle, and have some respect for them. Okay. Another thing about so in the with the Greeks, there's no scripture. Uh, the only evidence allowed is a priori and a posteriori. Enlightenment, if there is any such thing, follows a long process, a lifelong process of questioning, and Plato calls it collection and division or the dialectic. And there's also no church authority. There's no official body of philosophers that says, "Oh, you're wrong," you know. So those things are not consistent with Christianity. In Christianity, we have the authority of Scripture, and Scripture supersedes logic. So if your logic is not supporting Scripture, there's something wrong with your logic. That's the way it's thought of. In St. Augustine is famous for saying, "You must believe so that you may understand." So I find this a bit creepy. It's like a cult thing. First, you believe what we say, and then you'll find that everything falls into place. And the problem with this is that human beings are excellent at assembling a group of beliefs that are consistent around a certain thought. I think an examination with MAGA would show that kind of phenomenon going on. But it also works with Marxism or Freudianism. You probably have known people who uh, shape or they shape all of their beliefs in accordance with their core belief, which is say Freud or Marx. I've told you the story about Bertrand Russell interviewing Lenin, and so I think that's a really dangerous thing to, okay, you accept this first, and then everything will fall into place. Well, what you're going to do is make everything fall into place. And that's what all of theology has done, or I would say most of theology has done, is saying, well, at first this doesn't make sense to you, but if you believe, you can find a way to make it make sense. It's kind of upside down of what Socrates does. Socrates says, well, that sounds really good, but what if we consider this? It's the exact opposite in a way. Uh, all right. Another thing in Christianity is that enlightenment can occur instantly in an epiphany. And this is the example of this we have is St. Paul on the road to Damascus and Augustine in his garden where he hears a voice. Uh, and these are instant epiphanies that all of a sudden change your life and everything becomes clear. If you go to a revival meeting at the end of the ceremony, people will be asked to come down front and accept Jesus. And supposedly at that moment, you become a new person. You're born again. And everything now will be different to you. This is so different from the Greek idea that it's a lifelong journey to try to understand the puzzles that life presents. And to me, it doesn't appeal to me. It seems dangerous to me to accept anything just because somebody says it. Another thing I might say, I don't want to offend anyone, but I don't believe there were ever magical people. I mentioned before that my attitude towards scripture is the same attitude I have towards geology that I mentioned. Uniformitarianism is the theory that whatever happened a long time ago is the same sort of thing that's happening now. This theory was proposed uh, to criticize. I think it was called catastrophism or something like that. The idea was the Great Flood or something like this. There was a catastrophe. My old boss, Commander Cody, liked the World in Collision book by Velikovsky, how this great catastrophe had happened. And I pointed out to him if that had happened, there wouldn't be any humanity. I mean, it was just a, a really ridiculous book, but Cody was good enough to say, okay. Uh, but it's a silly book, and it's the idea is that there was some catastrophe that created the world we have now. Now there have been catastrophes like the Permian extinction or the extinction that killed the dinosaurs. It's not like there haven't been any, but none that radical have happened since the Bronze Age when we were writing the Bible. And so it seems unlikely to me that there were magic people running around that had a hotline to Jesus or a hotline to God, which is exactly who Muhammad was. Muhammad was somebody who the gods spoke to personally. Angel Gabriel dictated the Quran to him. That's how we have the Quran, and why Islam thinks that it's superior to Christianity and Judaism because those texts were written down by people who sometimes kludged things together and didn't write them down correctly, and they were handed down for other generations. Whereas Muhammad has the exact words of Allah. Correct me as always, correct me at any point where I say something that you think is incorrect, but I believe that's the teaching of of Islam. Okay, so I from an early age found it weird. I mean, when I went to Sunday school, I was raised a good Christian boy, and they told me this stuff about this guy went out on the mountain and he got this. these two tablets of stone, and that was uh, a magic thing that happened. I never could accept that. I mean, I don't know. It really does seem like brainwashing that happened to me as a Sunday school kid. That's maybe an insulting way to say it, but they just tell you these stories over and over and over until I guess you accept them as part of life. You know, Adam and Eve and Moses and the burning bush and the parting of the Red Sea and all that stuff. But from an early age, I mean, I'm saying maybe 6 or 7 years old, I'm going, I don't know about that. That doesn't seem quite right to me. So I wasn't a good candidate for being a devout Christian. That said, I don't want to give the impression that I'm anti-Christian because two of my greatest heroes were Christians, Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King. And some of my favorite passages in all of literature are found in the Bible. So I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some beautiful things in all religions. And okay, just to be clear, I don't want to offend anyone. All right, moving on to the next thing, which is ethics. Now, the ethics of Christianity is what we call eschatological. Eschatology means to do with the end times and just judgment day, right? So uh, the idea of Jesus' ethics is not, we've raised this before, it's not um, teleological. Jesus is not trying to create a world where uh, poor people are treated more equitably. He doesn't get involved in politics. He famously says, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. That's not what he's about. He's about your individual eternal soul. And the reason we call this eschatological is because it has to do with on Judgment Day, when you meet St. Peter, will you be able to uh, face him and with a good conscience and say, well, I've been a good servant. I have done the right things. That's really the core of Christian ethics. And all religious ethics, including Christian ethics, are deontological in the sense that they are not concerned with an outcome. Now, if you're a Christian theologian, you're going to kind of deny that because what you're going to say is that if everybody obeyed the Ten Commandments, for example, it would be a better world. That's what they would say. And so, yes, it will result. But the reason you obey the Ten Commandments is not to create a better world. It's it's so that your eternal soul will be saved. Um, I always found it pretty odd that the all of the evangelicals want. Maybe I've said this before. Want to post the Ten Commandments. That's not Christian. It's Judaic thought, and isn't it much more beautiful to post the Beatitudes? I don't get that. It just seems very strange to me because the Beatitudes are much more in tune with what I think of as Christian than are the Ten Commandments. And by the way, the Ten Commandments don't include, there's no rule against child abuse, there's no rule against slavery. These are not incidental crimes. And yet, there's a rule against lusting. I don't know. I think lusting is pretty much impossible. Or coveting. I mean, you could covet all. I used to covet guys who could play drums, man. I wanted to play like that, and I coveted it. So that's a sin, but if I would have raped a child, that's not listed. So I don't get the Ten Commandments as a good list but anyway, the point is that the objective that you're trying to achieve here with Christian ethics is the purity of your eternal soul, not the betterment of mankind. And as a matter of fact, I usually say when I'm talking about John Stuart Mill that if we work to create a world that achieved the greatest happiness for the greatest number, according to Augustine, that would be an evil world because people are attracted to evil things. And if they all got their way, they would all be doing evil things, and that would be a terrible world. So I don't know. Also, one more thing that's I want to distinguish between Christianity and the Greeks is there's no set of rules, like I just mentioned. The Greeks don't have such a set of rules. Socrates doesn't have a set of rules. Plato doesn't have a set of rules. Aristotle doesn't have a set of rules. They may have kind of advice or something like that, but there's no specific set of rules. We don't see that from the Greeks. So that's a difference. All right, moving on to aesthetics. And stop me, of course, at any time, as always. Moving on to aesthetics. Uh, the Greeks loved the world, the physical world that we inhabit. And they focus their religion around the world. And I want to show you a little slideshow here, if I may, that exemplifies this. Let me get it up here. Uh, okay, this is a cave of the nymphs in Cephalonia. Cephalonia is an island that's next to Ithaca, and it was part of uh, Odysseus's kingdom. So this is the cave of the nymphs, and this is a sacred grotto for the Greeks. Um, this is the Cave of the Nymphs in Delphi. These are the sacred spots that we don't really have in Christianity. All of our sacred spots are associated with, you can go to the Holy Land and you can visit sacred places, or you could go to one of the churches, and those are considered sacred. But the Greeks had natural places that were considered sacred. This is the river Acheron or Styx, and this is Acheron is how it's called in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, I believe. Um, Anne could correct me on this if I misquoted that, but uh, so this is a picture of oh no, in the Hollow Man. I have it right there, but I can't read. It's not from Wasteland. It's
It's
from
the
the
hollow,
Hollow. What's that?
MEN, the hollow men.
Hollow Man. Oh yes, Hollow Man. Sorry, I'm just screwing everything up here, Ann.
Lots of
Good thing we have you along. And
ah,
this is the cave of Zeus in Crete. And of course, you've seen this is the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and you see the view there that they really like with their theaters and temples if they can. And then this is Mount Olympus, which I mentioned before. This is the Acropolis. Now, this is the Panathenaea. So it's an artist rendering of the sacred. I think every 5 years they had a really big one, but every year they had a Panathenaea, which is an outdoor ceremony where everybody proceeds up this great staircase to the Acropolis, and then they do various sacrifices to Athena. It's all done outside. The Greeks worshipped outside. The temples, the great Greek temples like the Parthenon, um, they weren't sanctuaries where the congregation would go inside. That's not what happened. All of the if any of you saw the computer renderings of ancient Greece, especially the Parthenon or the Acropolis that I sent links to, you'll see somebody performing a ritual outside, a priestess performing a ritual outside in the Acropolis. And that's how it was done. All their rituals were outside, they weren't inside because they, I I think they perceived the earth as being their home, not some sequestered place. And also, they were looking up at the sky and hoping the God would pay attention to them. And this is just kind of an artist rendering of what the Panathenaea, which is a big holy ceremony, would have looked like. Now, what I have next is this is the statue of Athena. This is actually in Nashville. I mentioned that they made a replica. I think they did this in the 30s in Nashville of the Parthenon, which is like Bible Belt country. It's kind of interesting. It got built down there, but anyway, that gives you an idea of the scale of the. This isn't made out of gold, but the one in Athens, the original one, was plated in gold. Um, statue of Athena. Okay, so by comparison, this is Notre Dame in Paris. And there's no light, there's no window even on the outside. Not only are you inside a building, but you can't even see the outside world. You're separated from the outside world, and these windows that you see above you, that's where the light comes in. And all the windows are, as you know, stained glass windows, often portraying the lives of the saints or biblical scenes. And that is the idea is the light is coming down from heaven and it's being interpreted by the Bible and it's then coming down to you. So everything is inside and you're in a sanctuary that is separated from the sinful real world. This is another picture of Notre Dame looking in the opposite direction. And this is another Gothic cathedral. This is a high art now of, just like the Parthenon is the high art of the Greeks, this is a high art of Christianity, the Gothic cathedral. And this is Saint Denis in Paris also. But here you get an idea of the fact that the outside world is separated from you. You are in a sanctuary, separated, and just can hear the word of God, as opposed to being distracted by the material world, which is not holy. So that's my summary of the. Oops, what happened here? Uh, where am I? What happened to me? Oh, here we go. Sorry, I lost my control. There we go. All right, I'm back. Aren't you delighted? Okay, the last thing I wanted to, okay, we've been through ontology, epistemology, ethics, and aesthetics. The last thing I want to mention is psychology. And I want to return for a second just to think about the symposium. Now, you'll remember in the symposium, Diotima says that all of uh, human psychology, all the three parts of the soul, are driven towards eternity. They seek eternity. The physical part of the soul, or the appetitive part, seeks it through physical reproduction. The passionate part of the soul seeks it through human accomplishment, nobility, and that kind of thing. And the rational part of the soul seeks it through understanding the eternal verities, in other words, geometry, for example. So this is a natural thing that in the symposium, Diotima argues is true of all humans, that they all seek eternity, and all animals even seek eternity with the physical part of their being. And this is opposed to St. Augustine, who has a fairly radical view that any kind of attraction to the material world, which is rich food, music, dance, bright colors, and he even says in the uh, Confessions that his attraction, his love for his son was an earthly love that detracted or distracted him from devotion to God. That's very radical. Like that's how unearthly un uh, or how focused on the supernatural Augustine thinks the pure Christian life is. And it's so different from Diotima's idea that we aren't attached to the physical world, but we are attached to the physical world, but we all seek eternity, even in that physical part that is so disparaged by Christianity. We seek eternity, and reproduction is part of our seeking eternity, as opposed to the Christian view that it's kind of repugnant and only has to be done because we have to reproduce. I'm sorry if that seems like an exaggeration, but it's not that much of an exaggeration from Aquinas and Augustine. Okay, that's it. I got through it. Oh my God. It's a lot of funneling to me to just narrow stuff down so it can be presented in an hour. But I think that's uh, enough said about the difference between the Greeks and the Christians. Any questions, arguments, disputations?
Can can you consider yourself a Christian if you voted for Trump?
Well, man, obviously people do, so you can.
I think this has to do with the ethics argument, but I'm not,
Don't get me started. I he's as close to an antichrist as has ever existed in America, as far as I'm concerned. All
yeah.
these guys parading Christian values that have never heard of Jesus's teaching about doing unto the least of these. It's repugnant to me.
I
They
actually,
don't seem to be familiar with the teachings of Jesus.
I actually had this argument with a friend, a very, very close friend who was a minister and has seemed, I don't know. And it was defending evangelicals. And I was trying to say, how can you, I don't know, how do you do that?
How did he? What was his point?
It's all about the spiritual stuff, keeping the politics out of it. And I said, well, how can you separate the morality of the situation from the spiritual? And I think that goes back to your discussion of ethics and, making the world better doesn't really matter. I don't,
Well, okay, but you
that,
still
does
have
that
to
make it?
you still have to
Yeah.
pay attention to what Jesus said. If you want to save your soul, you can't be ignoring what he said. I don't see how they don't ignore what he said.
Well, yeah, I would agree, but I mean, I don't understand it, but a lot of things I don't understand.
Well, I'm sure that's true of all of us.
Hmm.
There was a lot of debate during the pre-Civil War era between different factions of Quakers who opposed slavery, but felt that they should stay out of politics while opposing it and wanting to live their own, at least some of them wanted to stay out of politics, live virtuous lives, do what they could to free slaves, but they felt that being involved in politics was getting into the world in a way that was not appropriate, though that was a relatively small faction. But I think there's different views on your own individual responsibility to lead a decent life and whether to trying to change the world around you. So,
Uh, I I can only speak personally that I'm one of these guys. There are a lot of people that won't vote because they think both parties suck. Well, this is the world you're thrown into the world. This is the world you're in. You don't have to get a chance to choose another world. So the Quakers can say, I'm going to be above it all, and I'm not going to tarnish my own soul by being involved in something as tawdry as politics. You can choose to do that if you want, but I think you're just being delusional. This is the world you live in. You don't get another world. And insofar as you don't uh, involve yourself in it, it doesn't mean you're supernatural and floating above it on a cloud. You're still participating.
Tony, are spirituality and morality two different things?
Well, they're both terms that are just floated around by anybody that wants to say anything that sounds important. And yes, they're not defined. You do it's whatever you say it is.
Okay.
I mean, spirituality is kind of a weird word. I've called it religion light before. You know, if you want to say you're spiritual and you're real heavy and you're real profound and you have deep thoughts, but you don't believe anything. Oh, okay. That's fine. Whatever you want. Words are pretty malleable.
Or I don't know.
Hey, Doug, mute yourself. Doug? Yeah, mute yourself because on the speaker view, anytime there's a loud sound, it'll switch to you. Not that you aren't beautiful. It's just that we uh, it affects. It doesn't affect this. I don't even see it because I'm looking at all of you. But when we when we post the speaker view, so that's true of all of you. Whenever you do something loud, it's going to switch to you. and you might be picking your nose, so just beware of that. Anyway, any more comments on this
Well,
this kind of
I think, it is very clearly the sort of received view of Christianity that was transmitted through the Catholic Church, which I think didn't entirely, it's not entirely the same in the Eastern Orthodox Church. So, but I think we're really in sort of Western civilization Catholicism, right? I mean that version, if you will.
I think most of the things I said also apply to Protestantism. You, I don't think I made that much of a distinction between doctrine, Catholic doctrine and Protestant doctrine.
Yeah, that's probably true. The Reformation didn't really
Well,
talk.
it changed some things, but it didn't change everything. The Reformation had a lot to do with the printing press, the fact that everybody could read the gospel and associate or have their own personal relationship with God rather than having it mediated through the Catholic Church.
Right. It was a structural change, though, in a lot of ways, more than a doctrinal change, if you
Well,
will.
I think the fact that the gospel and the truth of Catholic doctrine has to be mediated through the church is a doctrinal change between Protestantism. Protestantism doesn't believe that, doesn't believe that the church, they can help, the ministers can help, but they aren't the Pope. They don't have the final say on the interpretation of the word of Jesus, whereas that's not true in the Catholic Church. So I think that's a doctrinal change.
So I will say what Dan's description of the Quaker world, where we don't actually have any designated official trained ministers, preachers. He says it's like index fund investing, as opposed to the Catholics who invest in a specific stock, as it were, and count on that. But that in the Quakers, where it's the ministry of everyone, is like an index fund, which often outperforms thinking that you can invest by picking a specific stock. That in the long run, the index fund, Dan, mind you, is a cradle Catholic who's back in that world.
That's very funny. And but Laurel, be careful now. Don't be guilty of the sin of pride by thinking your
No,
situation is superior to the other one.
no, I've heard some very strange versions of ministry in the Friends world, but um, I kind of like silence, actually. So
Can't go wrong with that.
it's hard to go wrong with silence. Is
It's true.
a piece of it,
That, that's true.
but no,
Uh,
has screwed up an awful lot. But
yeah,
You
Meredith.
know, in England, Protestantism had a lot to do with the objection of some of the rulers to how much wealth the church was sitting on, like Henry VIII, for example, who decided that he didn't like the fact that the Catholic Church would not only own its own land, but then its people would go out and colonize all around and have their businesses. And little by little, those communities around the churches were much wealthier than other places. And one thing he did was to go and tape the roofs off of the churches, and it made them off of the abbeys, so that it made it much harder for the monks and the priests to operate. And so I think that worldly things like wealth have made a lot of difference in how religion has developed. And I know that Ireland is still very solidly Catholic, but England is not. No, Neil, not true.
Neil,
It's expropriate all this
my
wealth for itself and
well,
friends.
no, they one of my daughter-in-law's Irish, and my kids are actually moving back to Ireland. Um, and it was true. It was the Catholicism was the core of the national movement of Ireland to free itself from England. And that was it was sort of as they coalesced around that, it gave the sort of the national view. It's kind of like Gandhi promoting Hinduism as a method for creating nationalism. And so, but that and that kind of that between that and politics and land people in Ireland finally collapsed because they tolerated all kinds of horrible kinds of improprieties in the Catholic Church. And so now you can almost can't get people to go into the priesthood in Ireland. They're closing them. I know, scary. But it is that pervading sense about, well, we're still all Catholic, right? You know, even my daughter-in-law will still go to mass.
The Irish Republican movement, especially in 1798 with the United Irishmen, was Protestants and Catholics together. That changed in the 19th century, but the Republicans, to begin with, many of them were Protestants, Presbyterians especially.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church has always been a little suspicious of Irish republicanism and the Irish independence movement. So that part's kind of complicated, I think.
Oh yeah, no, and that's true. It was only with the final kind of revolution in the 1916 and the Easter Rebellion
That
and
was
so on. You're right. It switched because at some point um, the two parts came apart, the North and the South.
Oh,
But anyway, yeah.
still there's long memories though of the famine, and that gets largely blamed on the quote Protestants. My dear Irish mother-in-law referred to all one word, the Protestant bastards.
All one word.
All one word, the Protestant bastards. And I only narrowly escaped that designation because some of the Quakers did some feeding of people. But when we visited the farm where she was born, we went out to the little spring out in the field that was allegedly dug by St. Patrick in between chasing snakes or something. And it was still used for saying mass out there during the period when it was like when the hedge priests came around and they weren't allowed to have services in church. So there was a sense of protecting the customs and traditions. On the other hand, she was very mindful of the offenses of the Catholic priesthood, and she didn't have a great deal of use for the priests or some of the nuns either, the more rigid things. So she had this funny dichotomy of views, and I think this was not uncommon for people in the sort of more rural parts of County Galway and other rural areas. I think that
Okay. This is going, we can continue this forever, and hopefully will next time. The next time what I'm going to introduce is something I don't usually talk about, which is the tradition of misogyny in the uh, documents of early Christianity, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the next thing we're going to do is Augustine after that, and I noticed some things on the chat, which I always look at. Doug asked about the author of how the Bible came to be, and somebody answered, I think it was Laurel. I'm not sure. I'd have to go look at my bookcase, but that might be it. And otherwise, let's call it a day. I think this has been, I'd like to think this has been a good one. And it's very wonderful to have Anne and Peter back. We missed you. And we hope for a continued brief stay, continued but brief stay away from home, and speedy recovery for you, because we really like having you here. And with that, I guess I'll say farewell, and we'll see you on what is today? On Tuesday?
Tuesday. Thank you so much. See
All
you
right.
guys.
All right, guys.